In a confrontation that would decide the fate of Chinese politics over the course of the next century, the Opium Wars of 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860 were fought between the imperial powers of the Qing Dynasty and the empires of Britain and France. During these various campaigns, the outdated and inefficient strategies and technology of the Chinese Empire were illustrated vividly when they went head-to-head with the modern weapons of the British and French, the defeat of the dynastic forces resulting in an upheaval to the once secure rule of the imperial royal family, and would sow the seeds of what eventually came to pass as their overthrow. In the mid-19th century, Western imperial powers such as Great Britain, France, and the United States were aggressively expanding their influence around the world through their economic and military strength, perhaps their most widespread export being that of religion, with Christian missionaries making rapid inroads into and ultimately displacing many of the ancient faiths of Asia. With free trade being the main weapon of the Western powers in sustaining their economic control over their rapidly increasing number of colonies, including India, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, and Vietnam, the only power to truly stand up to the expansion of the imperial forces from the West was the Qing Dynasty of China, which had ruled the gigantic nation since 1636 and had its origins rooted in Manchuria. China was a notoriously traditional nation, with Confucianism being the main system of beliefs that had shaped and organized the country's culture, politics, and society for centuries, Confucianism being secular, and was thus not rooted in either religion or a belief in the presence of an individual god or gods, thus meaning it was not generally opposed to the progress of science as per Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism had demonstrated throughout the previous centuries. However, while China was open to the concept of science, it was not effective in responding to Western industrialism, mercantilism, and military strength, 19th century China being primarily land-based, and was administered by highly conservative Confucian-based political, social, and economic management that had existed for more than 5,000 years, with the emperor, seated in the forbidden city of Peking, being overall ruler and taking the closest position to God within Chinese society. Throughout the early 1800s, trade between China and the West took place within the confines of the Canton system, as based in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou, which was also known as Canton, this system having been developed by the preceding Ming Dynasty of 1368 to 1644 and was expanded upon by their successors, the Qing or Manchu Dynasty. In 1757, the Qing Emperor ordered that Guangzhou would be the only Chinese port open to trade with foreigners, and that trade could only take place through licensed Chinese merchants, essentially restricting foreign trade and subjecting it to stiff regulations imposed by the Chinese government. Under the Canton system, Great Britain worked a three-nation trade operation, exporting Indian cotton and British silver to China and importing Chinese tea and other Chinese goods to Britain, the balance of trade by the turn of the 1800s being firmly in China's favour due to the enjoyment of Chinese tea, together with porcelain and silk, among royalty, the elite, and the general public in Britain. By contrast, British products had little to no demand in China, and thus a major trade imbalance was noted between the two nations, Britain increasingly having to use silver to pay for its expanding purchases of Chinese goods, and by the late 1700s attempted to alter this unequal situation by replacing cotton with opium, as exported from India, thus resulting in huge economic success for the British that, by 1820, saw the Chinese now having to pay in silver to cover its purchases. The opium sold by the British was derived from the sap of poppy plants and had been used for medicinal and sometimes recreational purposes in China and other parts of Eurasia for centuries, the colonization of India and Southeast Asia by the British, meaning that the British East India Company, established to allow free trade across East Asia and India, could invest heavily in the growing and processing of opium, especially in the eastern Indian province of Bengal, developing a profitable monopoly over the cultivation of opium that would be shipped and sold to China. From its once largely medicinal function, opium in China was now primarily used for recreation, and thus led to an epidemic of addiction that saw Chinese citizens desperately seek to acquire any and all stocks of opium, while withdrawal led to punishing pain and cramps that sometimes even resulted in fatal outcomes. Seeing the increasing scourge of opium addiction within its population, the Chinese government, in 1800, banned both the production and importation of opium, followed in 1813 by the outlawing of opium consumption, with those caught in possession or using opium being subject to a vicious beating 100 times. In response, the British East India Company hired British private and American traders to transport the drug to China, while Chinese smugglers bought the opium from British and American ships anchored off Guangzhou and distributed it within China through a network of middlemen, this smuggling network being so vast that by 1830 there were more than 100 vessels operating on the run, between Guangzhou and the foreign ships. This system, however, was upturned in 1834, when in order to undercut the British suppliers, dealers lowered their selling price and thus made it easier for more people in China to buy opium, allowing for a more widespread market with increased addicts and breaking the monopoly once held by the British East India Company. So lucrative was the opium trade that in the 28 years between 1810 and 1838, the number of opiate chests being shipped to China had increased from 4,500 to 40,000, and silver payments had risen from around 2 million ounces in the early 1820s to over 9 million ounces a decade later. The opium trade wasn't just restricted to low-level smugglers and dealers, though, as in 1831, the Daoguang Emperor discovered that members of his own army, government, and even students were also partaking in not only opium consumption, but also distribution among the ruling classes of the Chinese state. This led, ultimately, to further measures being taken in 1836 to reinforce the original 1813 ban, with opium dens closed and dealers executed, the emperor seeking advice from his ministers as to how a more radical approach should be adopted in order to heavily crack down on the opium trade. One solution came in the form of legalizing opium production and distribution, and thereby bringing this trade under Chinese taxation laws, with steep levies applied that would price potential users out of the market, while the money collected from taxing the opium trade could help the Chinese government reduce revenue shortfalls and the outflow of silver. By contrast, Lin Zexu, a capable and ambitious Chinese government official, argued that the opium trade was a moral issue, and that in the face of large swathes of the Chinese population being incapacitated by their addiction, the imperial state should instead target the importers. This led, on June 3, 1839, to Lin arriving in Guangzhou to supervise the ban on the opium trade and to crack down on its use, attacking the business at several levels that included direct correspondence with Queen Victoria of Britain, in which he questioned her morals in allowing her subjects to actively support a crippling drug trade, while in a more direct move arresting over 1,600 Chinese dealers and destroying tens of thousands of opium pipes. At the same time, he also demanded that foreign companies, particularly the British East India Company, turn over their supplies of opium in exchange for tea, the British refusing to do so, and thus led Lin to halt all foreign trade and quarantine the area to which the foreign merchants were confined. In the end, after a 6-week stalemate, the foreign merchants capitulated and turned over £2.6 million, or more than 20,000 chests, worth of opium to the Chinese forces, with Lin's troops also seizing and destroying the opium that was being held on British ships, leading to a dispute between the British superintendent and Lin, with the former claiming that the vessels were anchored in international waters and therefore free from Chinese authority, while Lin declared that they were in the waters of the Chinese islands. Hiring 500 Chinese men, Lin had the opium destroyed by mixing it with lime and salt before dumping it into the bay, followed shortly thereafter by his application of political pressure on the Portuguese government in their colony of Macau to have the British expelled from their territory, to which they were eventually forced to take up residence in nearby Hong Kong. Lin's widespread destruction of the Canton opium industry had severe consequences, as in the face of British ships having been seized in the harbour and their cargo destroyed, the British considered this to have besmirched not only their pride, but also the very concept of free trade, the main colonial weapon of the British Empire in maintaining economic hold over its territories. The economic ramifications of Lin's actions, which cost the British millions of pounds worth of opium trade, together with the continued undercutting of opium dealt through the British East India Company by domestic Chinese dealers, gave the political class of the UK the perfect excuse to forcefully expand British imperial interests in China. With tensions at fever pitch, during July 1839, a group of intoxicated British merchant sailors beat a Chinese civilian to death while ashore in Kowloon, 2 men being arrested by British Superintendent Elliot and paid compensation being offered to the family of the man killed. However, Elliot, aware of the severe punishment for murder under the Chinese legal system, in this case death by beheading, refused to surrender the 2 sailors to the Chinese authorities when pressed, including Lin himself, Elliot instead presiding over a brief trial held aboard the British ship, whereupon the 2 men were convicted of assault and rioting, and thus sentenced to hard labour in the UK and fines, though this verdict was overturned upon their return to Britain. In the face of what Lin perceived as another British violation of Chinese sovereignty, matters escalated rapidly, with Chinese labourers being recalled from Macau, food sales to the British being stopped, and rumours spread that the dynastic forces had poisoned the freshwater springs used to replenish supplies for foreign vessels, while in military terms, war junks assembled at the mouth of the Pearl River as a clear sign of China being prepared to mobilise against the Westerners. On August 23rd, a ship belonging to a prominent opium merchant was attacked by Lascar pirates while traveling downriver from Canton to Macau, with rumor having it that the assault was conducted by Imperial Chinese troops, and thus forced Elliot to order all British vessels away from the coast of China by the following day, though under continued political pressure from Lin, the colony of Macau denied British ships entry into the harbour. By this point, over 60 British ships and over 2,000 people were now stranded off the Chinese coast with no access to provisions, with Elliot negotiating with the Qing authorities to have the embargo on food and water lifted, while HMS Volage was dispatched to the area so as to ward off any potential attack from the Chinese war junks now roaming the Pearl River. Desperately running short of supplies, Elliot ordered an armed schooner and a cutter into Kowloon harbour so as to procure supplies, but with the commander of the local Kowloon fort refusing to allow any trade with the British by local merchants, Elliot issued an ultimatum that if they were not resupplied by 3 p.m., the British ships would open fire on the Chinese war junks stationed in Kowloon Bay. Ultimately, this ultimatum was ignored, and with the passing of the deadline, Elliot ordered an assault on the Chinese vessels, leading to a prolonged battle that lasted well into the night, resulting in 2 killed and 6 wounded on the Chinese side, against 3 wounded on the British side, the war junks retreating under cover of darkness, and Elliot being able to take on supplies through the bribing of Qing officials in Kowloon, one of whom was local commander of the Kowloon fort, Lai Onju, who was tasked with giving a highly false account of the battle's outcome to his superiors so as to give an incorrect appraisal of the Royal Navy's strength, declaring a complete Chinese victory with multiple British ships sunk and heavy casualties. With the Battle of Kowloon, the First Opium War had officially begun, though no formal declaration of war between Imperial China and the British Empire was made, an initial stalemate ensuing throughout the autumn of 1839 as British and Chinese vessels moved to establish defences of their various assets in the region, and no major fighting took place throughout October despite the heightened tensions. This all changed at the end of that month, when the Quaker-owned merchant vessel, Thomas Coutts, sailed into Canton as a sign of protest against the British opium trade, hoping to re-establish shipping connections between China and the foreign merchants for goods not related to opium, and could negotiate to legally unload their goods at Chuen Pai, an island near Humen. However, as Elliot sought no compromises on the matter of the opium trade, he strongly disagreed with the example set by the crew of the Thomas Coutts, and thus he tasked the Royal Navy to establish a blockade of the Pearl River that would halt all ocean-going trade to and from Canton. Matters would come to a head on November 3rd, when merchantman Royal Saxon attempted to force its way through the blockade and into Canton, HMS Volage and HMS Hyacinth firing warning shots at the Royal Saxon that aroused the attentions of the Chinese war junks, who set out to protect the merchant ship. What followed was a decidedly one-sided battle between 2 modern heavily armed British ships of the line and up to 29 dynastic war junks and fire rafts, the results of which led to 4 war junks being sent to the bottom, while many more were severely damaged or disabled by British guns, resulting in both fleets withdrawing, the local Chinese commander once again giving a highly exaggerated account of the battle's outcome, declaring an overwhelming Chinese victory, when in truth the war junks had proven ineffective against the technologically advanced Royal Navy warships. In Britain, the matter of how to respond to China's actions against the opium trade were debated heavily in Parliament, the opium trade, while earning huge sums of capital for the British economy, being condemned not only by the UK public, but also by the government of the United States, with support for any action to resume this business through military force being held in disfavour. Compounding matters was the unstable position of the sitting government, with Prime Minister William Lamb, 2nd Viscount Melbourne, having barely survived a vote of no confidence on January 31, 1840, Melbourne seeing the troubles in China as a potential opportunity to distract from his cabinet's own inefficiencies and unify Parliament as a crusader of free trade. His proposed escalation of hostilities against the Qing government, as set out in a motion on April 7, 1840, in the House of Commons, was met with a mixed response, pro-war voices being led by Foreign Secretary and future Prime Minister Henry John Temple, 3rd Viscount Palmerston, who was notoriously aggressive in his desire for free trade and expansion, believing that the destroyed opium was in fact British property rather than contraband, and thus reparation should be made by the Chinese as to the lost goods. Meanwhile, many notable members of Parliament, including Sir James Graham, Lord Philip Stanhope, and William Ewart Gladstone, another future Prime Minister, led a strong anti-war faction that denounced the opium trade, a vote taken against the escalation of hostilities on April 9th, being narrowly defeated with 262 votes for and 271 against, though by this point a large fleet of British warships were already on their way to China regardless of Parliament's outcome. At the same time, military factions had been mobilized in British India during November 1839, with the proposed campaign being that the Royal Navy warships would blockade the mouths of the Pearl and Yangtze rivers, and then capture the Chusan Islands, all of this taking place alongside the issuing of letters to the Emperor with a list of demands, chief among which was the resumption of free trade and the general immunity from Chinese justice for British subjects found trading in opium. In preparation for the conflict, all British merchant vessels were withdrawn from the region, while Royal Navy ships of the line were assembled at the mouth of the Pearl River as part of the China Squadron, the dynastic forces, including both naval elements under Admiral Guan Tianpei and army troops under General Yang Feng, believing that the British could easily be repelled as per the 1834 Napier Affair, a similar trading dispute in which the Chinese were able to successfully resist against unreasonable British demands. The main objective for the upcoming conflict was not a full-scale campaign for conquest, but instead punitive action against Chinese aggression, with the primary strategy being to have British warships attack Chinese ports and rivers in retribution for the actions of the Qing government against the opium trade, infantry units being mustered in both Britain and India, with Bengali volunteers being recruited to supplement the regular British Indian Army and the forces of the East India Company. For sea combat, the Royal Navy's forces were split between two concurrent political dilemmas, the budding Opium War in China and the emerging Oriental crisis during the summer of 1840 as part of the Egyptian-Ottoman War, nearly leading to open conflict between Britain, France and the Ottoman Empire over Syria, vessels of the European fleet being dispatched to the eastern Mediterranean, while those ships partaking in the Chinese War would be dispatched from British South Africa and Australia to a rendezvous point in Singapore. Amassing throughout the spring of 1840, in late June the first elements of the expeditionary force arrived in China aboard 15 barrack ships, 4 steam-powered gunboats, and 25 smaller boats, a final ultimatum being issued to the Qing government demanding compensation for the halting of the opium trade, but this was ignored by the authorities in Canton. Thus, the first move by the British was against the islands of the Chusan archipelago, with Zushan Island, the largest and best defended of the islands, being the primary target due to its vital port of Dinghai, the initial action taking place on the water, where the Royal Navy easily routed the fleet of 12 war junks harboured in Dinghai, while Royal Marines were landed to the south of the city and captured the hills overlooking the port. Dinghai was ultimately captured on July 5, 1840, after an intense naval bombardment, with the strategically important city now being used as the main base of operations for the ongoing campaign against the Chinese coast, though due to an outbreak of fever in the autumn that spread rapidly through the ranks of the British occupying forces, of the 3,300 men originally garrisoned following the city's conquest, only 1,900 remained, with around 500 British soldiers being reported to have succumbed to the disease, and most of the incapacitated being taken back to India for recuperation. Regardless of the outbreak in Dinghai, the wider Opium War saw the British expedition divided into 2 attack groups, one advancing south to the Pearl River and the other north to the Yellow Sea, moving against the city of Peiho, where Superintendent Elliot began direct negotiations with the Qing authorities and outlined the list of demands from the British Foreign Office. With Qi Shan, a high-ranking Manchu official, being selected by the Imperial Court to replace Lin as the Viceroy of Liangguang after the latter's failure to resolve the opium crisis, the two sides, after a week of negotiations, agreed to resume discussions in Canton, and as a courtesy, the British withdrew their fleet from the Yellow Sea, in exchange for Qi Shan promising to requisition imperial funds as a restitution for British merchants who had suffered damages. This, however, did not stop the fighting, with British forces preparing an offensive against the Pearl River, spurred on primarily by the arrival of newly constructed East India Company iron steamer Nemesis, a weapon to which the Chinese Navy had no effective counter, as demonstrated on August 19, 1840, during the Battle of the Barrier, where the Royal Navy unseated the Chinese defences on the artificial land bridge connecting the Portuguese colony of Macau to mainland China. During the battle, the Chinese war junks and land defences were hopelessly outclassed by the combined naval and army attack force, leading to no casualties on the British side against 60 killed for the dynastic forces, the Portuguese, who remained neutral in the conflict, seeing the British victory as the removal of the stranglehold held by the much larger Chinese political system, meaning they were now willing to allow the Royal Navy to anchor in the colonial port of Macau, granting the expeditionary force 2 strategic harbours at Dinghai and Macau from where they could launch their assault on the Pearl River. 5 months later, in order to secure a commanding position on the Pearl River, and hopefully bring the Chinese government to the negotiating table, the British forces sailed south to Xiumen in order to gain full control of the river down from Canton, Qing Admiral Guan Tianpei, anticipating this move, and thus dispatched sizable reinforcements to Humen in order to fortify its defences, with 10,000 dynastic soldiers positioned in the garrison so as to ward off the enemy assault. Arriving in early January 1841, the bombardment by British forces on Humen began following the successful destruction of multiple Chinese fire rafts being sent towards the Royal Navy ships, Humen eventually being conquered on January 7th, when the British won a decisive victory in the Second Battle of Chuenpai, destroying 11 war junks of the Chinese Southern Fleet and capturing the Humen forts, meaning the British could now easily blockade the Pearl River, while the Qing Navy was forced into retreat upriver back to Canton. As expected, the capture of Humen and subsequent blockade put the British in a heavily advantageous position against the Qing government, with Qishan, certain that Chinese forces could not reconquer the captured territory in the face of the superior British fleet, attempting to prevent the war from widening further by negotiating a peace treaty, drafting the Convention of Chuenpai on January 21st, a document which both parties hoped would end the war. As per the terms of the convention, this would establish equal diplomatic rights between Britain and China, exchange Hong Kong Island for Chusan, facilitate the release of shipwrecked and kidnapped British citizens held by the Chinese, and reopen trade in Canton by February 1st of the same year, while China would also pay $6 million silver as recompense for the opium destroyed at Humen in 1838. However, the legal status of the opium trade was not resolved, while despite this convention potentially bringing an end to hostilities, neither side agreed to sign the document, the Daoguang Emperor refusing to allow Qing territory to be exchanged without his permission, and thus had Qishan arrested and given the death sentence, which was later commuted to forced military service. For the British, aside from the matter of the opium trade having not been resolved, Superintendent Elliot was considered to have overstepped the mark by developing a peace treaty with Qishan, independent of either government's involvement, and thus he was removed from command, and the British demanded more concessions to be forced from the Chinese, the drafting and ultimate failure of the convention having caused a temporary truce between the two sides that lasted until the beginning of February, after which the British demanded the reopening of Canton to their trade. On February 19th, in the wake of the Chinese refusing to allow the British to return to Canton, fighting restarted when a longboat from HMS Nemesis came under fire from a fort on North Wangtong Island, demanding a British response through a blockade of the Pearl River and the continued advance upriver towards Canton by the Royal Navy fleet that saw Qing fortresses captured one by one over the course of the next few weeks. Outmatched by the technologically advanced British attack squadron, the Qing forces suffered heavy casualties, with Admiral Tianpei being killed on February 26th, while the forts of Pazhu and Whampoa were captured on March 2nd that threatened the eastern flank of Canton, Superintendent Elliot, who was unaware that he had been dismissed, reaching an agreement with the Governor-General of Canton that a 3-day truce should take place from March 3rd, though this respite only served to allow either side to reorganize their factions, British forces from Chusan arriving on the Pearl River, while General Yang Fang mobilized 30,000 men in the area surrounding Canton. On March 13th, the frigate HMS Samarang and the steamships HMS Nemesis and HMS Atalanta did what the Chinese thought impossible by navigating the waterway between Macau and Canton, which was notable for being only 6 feet deep in certain places, the shallow drafts of the warships meaning they could overcome these obstacles, and in the space of 3 days were able to destroy 9 junks, 6 fortresses, and 105 guns in what was known as the Broadway Expedition. With the British now on the move, the Chinese fortified the defences at Canton, the Battle of Canton commencing from March 18th, wherein the city was partially occupied by the British, with trade reopened after negotiation with the Cohong merchants, colonial troops fighting street to street, until they eventually conquered the high ground around Canton, leading to another truce being declared on March 20th. In mid-April, Yishan, who replaced Qishan as Viceroy of Liangguang, declared that trade should remain open and sent emissaries to Elliot, all this being done as a ruse in order to allow Qing forces time to reassemble outside the city, with 50,000 troops being mustered in the countryside around Canton, while the profits made from the resumption of trade was put into rebuilding defences on the Pearl River. Though there was a momentary peace, this all ended when a bulletin sent from the Daoguang Emperor to his forces in Canton was leaked, in which it was stated that the Qing troops should drive the British from the Pearl River and reclaim Hong Kong, Elliot ordering on May 20th that all merchants evacuate Canton by sunset, while as many ships of the line as possible were dispatched to the city harbour in preparation for the upcoming hostilities. On the night of May 21st, the Qing launched a coordinated night attack on the British Army and Navy, with concealed artillery batteries hidden in Canton and on the Pearl River, firing upon the British ships while Qing soldiers moved to retake portions of the city, this action being supported by a large formation of 200 fire rafts connected by a chain being sent drifting towards the British ships at Canton, and fishing boats armed with matchlock guns began to engage the Royal Navy. The British, however, were fully prepared for this assault, and having avoided the fire rafts, these wayward vessels crashed into the waterfront at Canton and started an inferno that destroyed a large portion of the city and cut off any means for the Qing army to advance. While having suspected that this counterattack would take place, a large fleet of Royal Navy warships was sailed from Hong Kong with all dispatch and arrived at Canton 3 days later, taking the last 4 Qing forts above Canton and bombarding the city. A chaotic retreat of the Qing army thus saw the British move forward into the surrounding countryside, though this was halted on May 29th, when a crowd of 20,000 villagers and townspeople attacked and defeated a foraging company of 60 Indian sepoys, thus demanding the withdrawal of colonial troops back to the river, the fighting coming to an end on May 30th, and Canton now being fully occupied by the British. Eventually, a limited peace treaty, widely referred to as the Ransom of Canton, was signed between Elliot and the Governor-General of Canton, the agreement of which saw British ships withdrawn from the harbour on May 31st, though Yi Shan, in a letter to the Emperor, gave yet another exaggerated claim that the British had been roundly defeated at Canton and that their forces were destroyed, meaning the Imperial Court had no accurate appraisal of the British strength going forward. With the Emperor planning his recapture of Hong Kong, the British prepared a campaign against the city of Amoy and a blockade of the Yangtze River, Elliot continuing to propose peaceful resolutions until July 29th, at which point he was informed of his dismissal and replacement as superintendent by Henry Pottinger, who wanted to negotiate terms with the Qing for the entire country of China rather than just the Pearl River. With Pottinger being firmly on the side of continuing to expand the confrontation, the British fleet sailed for Amoy on August 21st, and 4 days later arrived at the mouth of the Juliang River, with August 26th seeing a combined naval and land assault on the city as conducted by regular infantry and Royal Marines that flanked and destroyed the Chinese defences guarding the river, though one of the Chinese defences proved difficult to destroy, withstanding over 12,000 cannonballs, and therefore had to be scaled and captured by ground troops. Amoy was thus abandoned the following day, and British troops entered the city without a shot being fired, the citadel's powder magazine being destroyed, 26 Chinese war junks being captured, and 128 cannons being thrown into the river, although in order to ensure that Amoy would remain available as an international trade port at the end of the war, any looting by the British occupying force was punishable by summary execution. However, with the British being unable to curry support from the Chinese merchants, who feared the wrath of the Qing government should they side with the invaders, the British withdrew to an island on the river so as to establish a garrison and blockade, the loss of all authority in Amoy, leading to the looting and violence the British had hoped could be avoided, which, after several days, was brought under control when dynastic troops retook the city, though once again, the Chinese governor for Amoy reported exaggerated claims to the Emperor of overwhelming victory, and that 5 British ships had been sunk during the fighting. On October 21st, the islands of Chusan, which had been returned to the Qing in exchange for Hong Kong under Elliot and Qi Shan's failed convention, was recaptured in an overwhelming British victory that saw 1,500 dynastic soldiers killed in the harbour of Dinghai, while 10 days later, a British naval force bombarded and captured a fort on the outskirts of Ningbo in central China, leading to a land battle between the British Army and 1,500 Chinese troops that saw the defenders thoroughly routed. Ningbo was ultimately captured 3 days later on October 13th, though soon the matter of British policy towards occupied Chinese territory and war prizes became a hot topic among the colonial command, Admiral Parker and Superintendent Pottinger considering that a percentage of all captured Chinese property should be turned over to the British as legal prizes of war, while General Goh argued that this would only turn the Chinese population against the British, and any property confiscated should be public instead of private, a settlement eventually being made that 10% of all property captured by the British Expeditionary Forces would be seized as war loot in retaliation for injustices done to British merchants. During the winter, fighting ceased as the British settled in for the long cold occupation, while in Peking, the exaggerated claims of overwhelming victories at Canton and Amoy were revealed to the Emperor as being instead crushing defeats, with Yi Shan, who was the Emperor's cousin, being tried by an imperial court and ultimately removed from command, a reappraisal of the British threat seeing Chinese towns and cities fortified against naval incursions. With the Daoguang Emperor appointing another of his cousins, Yi Jing, as head of the military, he was ordered to retake Ningpo on March 10, 1842, leading to a major battle that saw the British lure his army into the streets of the city before ambushing them, resulting in heavy Chinese casualties and a pursuit of the retreating army across the countryside to the nearby city of Zixi, which was subsequently taken on March 15th. The spring and early summer of 1842 saw continued defeat after defeat for the dynastic forces, with the important harbour of Zapu being captured on May 18th, most Chinese ports now being blockaded, and 25 warships with 10,000 men being sailed up the Yangtze from Ningpo in order to assault the central Chinese mainland, capturing the emperor's tax barges and thus striking a devastating blow that slashed the revenues of the imperial court in Peking to a fraction of what it had been. On June 14th, the mouth of the Hangpu River was captured by the British fleet, followed 2 days later by the towns of Wusong and Baoshan, thus opening Shanghai to land assault that saw the city heavily looted by retreating Qing bannermen, British soldiers, and local civilians, the vital city of Nanjing now being open to attack, thus requiring the assembly of 56,000 Manchu bannermen and Han Green standards to defend the Liangjiang province. Desperate to mount a defense, manpower from the Chinese industry was drafted into the imperial army so as to defend against the British invaders, thus leading to a loss of productivity and a lack of farmhands available to reap vital crops from the summer harvest, while motions of peace were made to the Daoguang Emperor, but only in relation to the Yangtze River and not the war as a whole, meaning British forces would have been paid not to enter the Yangtze. On July 21st, the British moved against the city of Zhenjiang, which was led by a disorganized Chinese defense that was rife with deserters, over 100 proclaimed traitors being killed in a mass execution just prior to the battle, which saw the Qing defenses blasted apart, though with the Chinese troops put into retreat, the British conducted their landing into the city too soon and were subsequently rushed by thousands of Chinese soldiers emerging from the narrow streets. Chaos rapidly ensued, with the British blowing up the Western Gate and storming the city, leading to widespread devastation as each faction fought street to street in masses of unestablished defences, many Chinese soldiers opting to commit ritual suicide with their entire families rather than be captured, pushing the death toll among both military and civilian factions into the high thousands, while for the British, they suffered their highest casualty rate for the entire First Opium War, with 36 men killed in action. With the capturing of the Grand Canal, an arterial route for grain shipments throughout central China, the problem of food shortages were exacerbated heavily, and famine began to grip the nation. That meant rationing of food stores was made a priority to the military, the British, by August 9th, now poised to assault the major city of Nanking, which, if lost, would be a devastating blow to the political class of the Qing Dynasty, and may have even resulted in outright revolution against the imperial court. With the Chinese government now essentially held at gunpoint, August 14th saw a Chinese delegation led by the Manchu High Court officials Qi Ying and Li Pu dispatched to the British fleet, leading to lengthy discussions between the two factions as to the ironing out of a peace treaty that the Qing representatives wished would be desirable to the Daoguang Emperor. Eventually, on August 21st, with no other options, the Daoguang Emperor authorized his diplomats to sign the peace treaty with the British, and the First Opium War officially ended on August 29, 1842, aboard HMS Cornwallis, the outcomes of the Treaty of Nanking being that the Qing Empire would recognize Britain as an equal to China and give British subjects extraterritorial privileges in treaty ports. In terms of changes in territory, the terms of the treaty resulted in Britain being provided an excellent deep-water port at Hong Kong, a huge indemnity to be paid to the British government and merchants, 5 new Chinese treaty ports at Canton, Shanghai, Amoy, Ningbo, and Fuzhou, where British merchants and their families could reside, the aforementioned extraterritoriality for British citizens residing in these treaty ports, meaning that they were subject to British, not Chinese laws, and a most favoured nation clause, that any rights gained by other foreign countries would automatically apply to Great Britain as well. For China, the results of the treaty were fully one-sided in favour of their adversaries, with Chinese imports of opium rising to a peak of 87,000 chests in 1879, while among Chinese officials, the aftermath of the war led to a bitter political struggle between factions aligned for and against the opium trade, with those in favour being in nominal control. Furthermore, Lin Zexu, the Qing diplomat who had started it all with his pushback against the opium trade, was made a scapegoat for dragging China into an unwinnable war and sent into exile, while the Canton system that had been in place since the 17th century was also ended, this being followed in 1844 by a system of unequal treaties between China and Western powers including the United States and France, the resultant most favoured nation clauses allowing Westerners to build churches and spread Christianity in treaty ports, and allowed Western imperialism and free trade to gain an immovable foothold in China. However, the First Opium War was also held in high disregard back in the victorious Great Britain, being considered an unpopular display of arrogance and land grabbing by a select group of politicians due to their involvement in a highly profitable but extremely damaging trade of opiates, with future Prime Minister Gladstone considering it to have been one of the most infamous and atrocious acts of the British state that had been unjustly calculated by the likes of Palmerston. However, while an unequal peace treaty had been signed, and the massive Qing Dynasty had been thoroughly humiliated by a smaller force of British invaders, the death of the Daoguang Emperor in 1850 led to a revival of antagonism against the opium trade by his successor, the Xianfeng Emperor, who sought to reinstate the politics of Lin Zexu and would thereby rally his forces to once again take on the Western powers.